That is a song called Burn from a band known as Neurosis off of their album The Eye of Every Storm, and a bit of a foreboding, ominous tone to that song, but I think it meshes well with the majority of the subject matter when it comes to these shows, and especially this show. It's just hard to throw in a happy-go-lucky, sing-along campfire song when, when you consider the bulk of the subject matter is just the result of misery and everything that entails. But the band Neurosis, if I could real quick, they had done something I thought which was pretty clever. I don't know if anybody else has done this, and you might ask why they did this. But what I'm getting at is they did a simultaneous release, and they released one album, but then they released a complimentary album. And what you're supposed to do is play both at the same time, and they offset each other. Why didn't they release everything on one particular album? I don't know. It's hard to say. But it is actually very cool because you could set up a CD on one side of the room and may say something on the other side of the room, sit in the middle, and just get bombarded with soundscapes. And again, it's all very cool. But anyway, I digress. This is Hexes and Soldiers, episode number 26. My name is Jason, and welcome back if you've been here before. And if you're new to the show, well, make yourself welcome as well. We're glad to have you. And as far as what's new, well, not a whole lot. I have some developments that have been taking place in my life. I won't go into them at this point, both good and bad, but we'll leave it at that. And been busy here and there with games, of course, and so that's good. But I'll hop right to it. And as far as news goes, Operational Studies Group, which I don't know if all of you are familiar with this, most of you should be, has a magazine, and I didn't know this. There's a free download from Operational Studies Group, and it's called War Game Design Volume 3, Number 3, and I have a lot of catching up to do apparently, because as I said, I didn't even know this thing existed, but it provides 32 pages of coverage, chock full of coverage on games from Operational Studies Group. And you can go to Consum World, which is where I found out about it, to download this, or NapoleonGames.com. That's NapoleonGames.com, which is the home of Operational Studies Group, and check that out. And then you have new from High Flying Dice Games, Panzers Along the Turk. And this covers an operation, the name of which I have unsuccessfully tried to pronounce, Ordschanikeds, and that's the best I can do. Anyway, this was the German 3rd Panzer Corps, that is 13th and 23rd Panzer Division's deepest penetration into Russia during November of 1942. During the first week of that month, the previous speedy advance towards Vladikavkaz, formerly Ordzhonikidze, see there's the name again, its oil riches along the Georgian road abruptly ended. The two panzer divisions, armed with over 150 tanks, now faced a growing array of Soviet forces, many of them armed with British and American tanks provided via Lend-Lease. And as each defense position was taken by the Germans, their advance continually slowed until reaching Gazelle. Then it stopped, and the German spearhead was then attacked from both flanks as their supplies ran low. So with the result still in the balance, Stalin arrived to rally his men. How good of him. Only a few miles kept the Germans from their objectives, and a well-prepared defensive line bolstered with NKVD soldiers were all that stood in their way. As the Soviet counterattacks increased in strength, the German line eventually broke, and the Soviets trapped the 13th Panzer Division. So the German offensive halted and then turned into a rescue mission, as the 23rd Panzer was unable to remedy the situation, and the 5th SS Division was called upon to rescue both of the German panzer divisions that were now near collapse. The city of Grozny and its oil fields were so near, yet so far. And the game features two 11 by 17 map sections, 560 color single-sided unit counters, 5 player aid sheets, and 12-page rules booklet. Runs you about 25 bucks, and then it says mounted counters are an extra $5. So what else? Um, as it rains and pours outside. Looks like a few shows back I did an episode that focused primarily on ASL and mentioned a few ways in which you could break into this quote cult end quote. But I forgot to mention yet another way, and that is via the second module, which is known as Paratrooper. And you'll still need the ASL rulebook, but what you would be getting this module for, ideally, is Chapter K. And what is Chapter K, you ask? Well, Chapter K is a training manual, no more, no less. And more specifically, it's a walkthrough of all the basic elements of the wonderful world of ASL. And it's written from the point of view of a drill sergeant leading a raw recruit, or you, in other words, through just what you can and cannot do. And this module also serves as a great refresher course if you've grown rusty. And now the scenarios in the thing all concern fighting by airborne troops from the June 6th to 8th behind the D-Day beaches. And other than a couple scenarios that involve captured French tanks, which are utilized by the Germans, the bulk of these scenarios deal with just infantry, so no gun or armor headaches to deal with if you have trouble with that. And I guess I should add, you'll still need the ASL rulebook if I didn't mention that, as well as Beyond Valor. So there is yet another way to break into the fast, fun world that is ASL. And then that is pretty much it as far as the news. Everything else has stayed relatively the same. No new fun, fantastic pre-orders to announce. So we'll just have to continue to sit on the edge of our seat and drown in anticipation. So as far as the Situation Room goes, and I do have a top 10, I should add, but that will be revealed after the Situation Room. But as far as the Situation Room goes, Fall Gelb, or Operation Yellow, was Hitler's plan for westward advancement, and if the French had any advantage at all, it was in the foreknowledge that they knew the Germans would be coming. Now the problem would lie in just how to hold them off, and the general mindset, pun intended, was to fight a modernized version of World War I, a strategy that focused on defense first and foremost. And it wouldn't be until the war was well underway that any offensive operations would be either considered or even ready. The idea being to buy time until the French could fully mobilize troops and materiel. And with the First World War on the French drawing board, they didn't intend to follow it to the letter necessarily, as in place of trenches, they would put a fortified line of defense built up with bunkers, pillboxes, impediments, tunnels, gun emplacements, and this would be known as the Maginot Line. And it was believed that this would effectively shield France against a German advance. Of note is the fact that this line didn't extend into the Franco-Belgian frontier, but more on that later. And in a nutshell, what the French were doing here was continuing the slow attritional style of warfare that predominated the First World War. Now for Hitler, after Poland's demise, he was chomping at the bit to repeat it in the West, but was stalled by inclement weather initially. Then in January of 1940, a plane crashes in Belgium, and on board apparently were crucial attack plans, and these dudes tried to burn these things apparently unsuccessfully a couple of times. I don't know if they ever actually got rid of them. Nonetheless, the crash and the possibility of the plans falling into enemy hands was enough to make Hitler start second guessing his intended offensive, and as a result, he turns to Manstein for an alternate plan. And his plan consists of a move directly north from Sedan against the rear of the main Allied forces in Belgium. And when Guderian was invited to contribute to this plan during informal discussions, he proposed a radical and novel idea. Not only his army corps, but most of the Panzerwaffe should be concentrated at Sedan, and this concentration of armor should subsequently not move to the north but to the west to execute a swift, deep, independent strategic penetration through the Ardennes toward the English Channel without waiting for the main body of infantry divisions, and this would become known as the Sickle Cut. So you might envision German armor just flooding everything before it, but in all actuality, the Germans were outnumbered in this fight, and some would argue they weren't outnumbered just in quantity alone. They had roughly, they being the Germans, had roughly 3,500 tanks against the Allies with about 3,500. But the main difference would be how the Germans used what they had. And they would form Schwerpunkts, which basically means point of impact. And Guderian talked specifically about this when he referred to striking someone with your fist rather than your open hand. And while the Allies spread their armor out, the Germans would focus on key strong points as means of breakthroughs. And Manstein would use his armor to strike deep into enemy lines far ahead of the main army. Now this was risky, of course, and relatively untested as well. And as a result, the more conservative German generals hated the idea. They thought it utterly irresponsible to create a concentration of forces in a position where they could not possibly be sufficiently supplied, while such inadequate supply routes as there were could easily be cut off by the French. And if the Allies did not react as expected, the German offensive could end in catastrophe. What is more, Hitler himself had his own reservations, but nevertheless gave the go-ahead. So on May 10th, 1940, the ball gets punted. German bombers strike Belgium and Holland not only with bombs but paratroopers as well, in addition to ground forces. And it's no time at all before the Germans grab the key Belgian fort of Eben Emael with a daring airborne operation. And what they did here is this fort was basically an oversized bunker, just huge in scope. In fact, it was big enough that the Germans just landed gliders on it and took it that way. So a lot of good that did. All told, the bombing raids and the sheer speed of the German advance proved completely overwhelming for the Dutch, who gave in not 4 days later. That's amazing. Meanwhile, the British and French had moved into Belgium with limited success, and more, advancing into the Low Countries, really only stood to help Hitler out. So on May 13th, the Germans began emerging from the Ardennes, and after a 2-day battle, panzers began crossing the Meuse. Now the French weren't just cannon fodder. Don't get that idea. They put up a fairly stiff resistance here and there, but they just couldn't really sustain it, and they were just overcome time and time again. So soon enough, it's Guderian leading the pack towards the Channel coast. With most of the Allies fighting in Belgium, there wasn't much that stood in his way, and as a result, he reached the English Channel on the 20th of May. With no reserves, the Allies tried to pull out of Belgium, while French forces under de Gaulle tested the vulnerability of overextended German flanks, as well as the patience of worried German generals. And on the 21st of May at Arras, a small British contingent meets Rommel's 7th Panzer Division and was able to hold it up, but again, only momentarily. So, all in all, it was too little too late, as German forces moved through Belgium and panzers were coming up from the south and southwest. And soon the Allies found themselves encircled, and the Belgians threw in the towel on May 28th, leaving a giant gaping hole. So the Allies briefly consider a counterattack, but in the end they choose instead to withdraw to French Channel ports. Now the French saw this as a kind of betrayal, but what it would ultimately do is save the entire British expeditionary force. For between the 26th of May and the 4th of June, no less than 338,000 troops were successfully evacuated from Dunkirk. And now you ask, and this is the major question that is still asked in the halls of academia as well as bar rooms. Now how could this happen? Guderian is poised for the knockout blow, right? But it never happens. Some say that a staunch defense of the Dunkirk perimeter, in concert with a battered Royal Air Force prevented this from happening, and I guess the bulk of the supporters of this argument might be British. But more likely was the fact that Hitler and his staff were simply a nervous wreck at having witnessed such a fast paced operation with its long extended lines. And I should add, it was during this campaign that Guderian earned the nickname Der Schnell Heinz, or Fast Heinz. And I guess I could back up just a second and say as well, the French were thinking along a defensive mindset, using World War One and its slow defensive attritional style of warfare as, if not the entire model, at least a model for the initial or first half of the war. And the Germans weren't that much different in their thinking, at least when it comes to the command. They too were still thinking along lines of World War One and a more slow, methodical development. And when you see people like Guderian and Rommel just basically shooting across the map, it made both sides nervous. And so, in all likelihood, for the German command, they were just simply unaccustomed to this style of warfare as well, and held Guderian up out of sheer caution, no other reason. As rapid warfare evolved, so too did the need for rapid planning, and I think that Guderian was so ahead of his time that the bulk of German command just hadn't caught up yet in their thinking and operational planning uh, that would coincide with this style of what would later become known as Blitzkrieg. But to move forward again, no sooner had the British Expeditionary Force successfully evacuated than the Germans struck out from the Somme in a southward direction on June the 5th, and I believe this would be known as Fall Rot, or Operation Red. And again, the French were able to hold their own here and there, but it never lasted. And on June the 9th, the Germans launched a major offensive on Paris. Finally, on June 14th, the first German troops entered the city, and then June 22nd has France formally surrendering. So, if we look at some post-analysis regarding this campaign, you can choose to look at things basically one of two ways. You can look at this as a French defeat or a German victory, and that might sound on the surface fairly obvious, but let's dig a little further. If you focus on the former, if you, looking at it as a French defeat, I guess you could point the finger at morale, French morale, and a pre-war French nation that was just chock full of dividing lines, and that an ununified country never bodes well for war-like situations. But it'd be better to look at the latter. For even though they were outnumbered, the Germans succeeded by way of near complete control of the air and better utilizing mechanized maneuver. More specifically, the main tool of the German land forces was combined arms combat, and in contrast to the Allies, they relied on highly mobile offensive units with balanced numbers of well-trained artillery, infantry, engineer, and tank formations all integrated into panzer divisions. And they relied on excellent communication systems as well. Each tank commander could communicate not only with his own crew, but with other tanks as well via radio. And this enabled them to break into a position and exploit it before the enemy could even react. Panzer divisions could carry out reconnaissance missions, advance to contact, defend, and attack vital positions or weak spots, and this ground would then be held by infantry and artillery as pivot points for further attacks. So, although their tanks were not designed for tank versus tank combat, they could take ground and draw the enemy armor onto the division's anti-tank lines. And this conserved the tanks to achieve the next stage of the offensive. So, the unit's logistics were self-contained, allowing for 3 or 4 days of combat, and the panzer divisions would be supported by motorized and infantry divisions. So even though the Germans, in some respects, did not know what to expect and then how to react properly to what occurred in France, In a lot of ways, they were prepared. And the German army lacked a formidable heavy combat tank, such as the French possessed, and relying instead on the Panzer I and II, which was armed with machine guns and 20 millimeter cannons, but also the Panzer III, which was a medium tank with a 37 millimeter cannon, which was intended to confront other tanks, as well as the Panzer IV, which is another medium tank designed more for infantry support based on what I read. But these were Panzer IIIs and IVs were much less abundant, and in armament and armor, the French tanks were the stronger designs and more numerous. Although the German vehicles were faster and more mechanically reliable, and they had radios. But while the German army was outnumbered in artillery and tanks, it possessed some critical advantages over its opponents. The newer German panzers had a crew of 5 men, a commander, a gunner, aimer, loader, driver, and a mechanic. And having a trained individual for each task allowed each man to dedicate himself to his own mission, and it made for a highly efficient combat team. The French, on the other hand, had fewer members, with the commander double tasked with loading the main gun, distracting him from his main duties in observation and tactical deployment. And in my opinion, that just spells disaster. But it made for a far less efficient system, as one would expect. Even within infantry formations, the Germans enjoyed an advantage through the doctrine of Auftragstaktik, or mission command tactics, and this would be used throughout the war, by which officers were expected to use their initiative to achieve their commander's intentions and were given control of the necessary supporting arms. And I guess I should add that this was used throughout the war until you get to a certain point in the East Front and Hitler dirtying his hands in the affairs of what should be field commanders. But when you look at the likes of Guderian, Manstein, and Rommel, these were all-stars, really, fighting against a team of bench warmers. No offense. But the speed and advanced style of their operations was just too overwhelming for the Allies, whose command and control was an old decrepit thing that crawled across the battlefield in comparison to the rabbit-like advance of German armor. And what is more, the Allied operational plan had more in common with Swiss cheese than a solid basis for action. So that is my 2 cents for what that's worth, and argue with that as you will. But the more interesting, perhaps, aspect is playing this stuff out. And in that respect, I guess war games are kind of role players. We play the roles of commanders. But so here's where the top 10 will come in, and this will be top 10 Blitzkrieg games. But when I say Blitzkrieg, I'm not including Poland here. This is more Operation Yellow or Fall Gelb. And I think I mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again. Hitler must have been a big fan of colors, because he's got a case blue, case red, case yellow, case white. Not sure what his deal is with that was. Perhaps a fetish for colors. Anyway, top 10 list deals with Operation Yellow. So we'll start at the bottom, work our way up. And what I have for number 10 is a magazine game. This would be Command Magazine Blitzkrieg 1940 by Ty Bomba. Came out in 1997, and Ty Bomba, I don't know what's up with him these days. His name was pretty prolific back in the day as far as game designs and development, but I haven't heard much from him lately. Now, I haven't played this game, so I know little to nothing about it, but based on some research I did on the Geek, as well as my own experience, that is what this list is comprised of. So number 9, Blitzkrieg General, 1999. Basically, this is a beefed up Axis and Allies game. So for the more seasoned grognard, be better to leave this thing alone. You could do better. Number 8, France 1940 by Jim Dunnigan, SPI. Avalon Hill picks this thing up in 1972. I owned this game. It was one of the first games I owned, and I remember setting this thing up and being utterly confused, as I was so fresh in the wargaming realm. But actually, looking back on it, it's pretty straightforward and kind of run of the mill, I guess you could say. But anyway, this game was first published in Strategy and Tactics magazine and later sold to Avalon Hill with very minor changes. And there was little or no input by Avalon Hill personnel. In fact, France 1940 was only a marginal simulation, which by no coincidence also made it a marginal game, and I would, I guess, agree with that for the most part. It was designed in such a way as to guarantee German victory time after time when using the historical setup cards for each nation. However, alternate setup cards for each nation based on plausible variations to the historical setups allowed players to alter the game's balance between Germany and the Allies, thus providing for a more balanced and, I guess, tense game at the cost of historical simulation value. Almost immediately after its publication, the game falls out of favor with players and scores consistently poorly on acceptability ratings. The main complaint from the simulation aspect is the lumping of nearly all infantry type formations on each side into generic core counters that were of strength 7 for the Germans, 8 for the British. I think you had a 6 for the French and a 4 or something like that for the Belgians and the Dutch. And the 7-6 German advantage over the French corps, coupled with a very common counterattack result on the combat results table, almost guaranteed a German win in any stand-up battles on the board. So the Allied player had to use an ahistorical order of battle to have any marginally remote chance of victory. So I guess you could change the strengths to help usher along a more historical simulation, but at the same time, this is a difficult historical event to simulate because the Germans did achieve such a decisive victory. If you want to game it, how do you avoid this? Well, it's difficult. Number 7, Panzer Grenadier, 1940, The Fall of France, by Michael Benninghoff and Philip Leonard from Avalanche Press 2009. And I'll just lay out my standard line when it comes to Avalanche Press, that being haven't played them, haven't heard that much good about Avalanche Press games. That's not to say that they are bad. One day I will break into the Avalanche Press foray, find out for myself, and let you know one way or the other, but that has yet to happen. Number 6, Victory in the West by David James, Richie Oriflamme, GMT 1993. Give that a look if you're a GMT fan. Bit dated, but that's not necessarily a bad thing either. Number 5, Großdeutschland 40 by Mr. Dean Essig, one of my favorite game designers, and Wig Graves, The Gamers 1993. Game number 5 in the Gamers Tactical Combat Series. This covers the battle for Stonne, France in 1940. And it's the first in the series to cover the infantry regiment Großdeutschland in World War II, and would of course be followed by perhaps better known titles, Großdeutschland 41 as well as 42. And if I'm not mistaken, this particular battle of which they speak, the Battle of Stonne, I think this place changed hands like 12 different times in one day. So some interesting stuff there. And then again, of course, this is a tactical treatment. So that brings us to number 4, Case Yellow, 1940 German Blitzkrieg in the West by Ted Ressier, GMT. And I'm confused when it comes to this game because it seems to be in the back of everybody's gaming shelves, if they even have it. And I wonder why this hasn't received more attention, why it isn't more popular than it is. But I'll just go on and say that this is a simple but accurate simulation. We created this monumental campaign. Each game turn is divided into 8 action segments. Each player has 4 action chits. The initiative player selects the first action chit to play. The remaining 7 chits are placed in an opaque cup and drawn randomly. In most cases, the Germans have the initiative and go first by playing one of their 4 action chits. Each German chit is marked for movement or combat, and the German player chooses what his army will do, though the German player during the course of a turn must use 2 chits for movement and 2 chits for combat. At the end of movement, any panzer or motorized formation adjacent to Allied units has the option to attack. If combat is chosen, all German units adjacent to Allied units may attack if allowed by terrain. Now, two Allied shits are marked two for movement and two for combat, not both. The creaky Allied command structure, and creaky it was, will bedevil the Allied player throughout the game. And I think that's very cool that they work that in. Need to move? Sorry, you just drew a combat shit. Isn't that awesome? Set up to attack? You drew a moved shit. And only the number of motorized formations equaling the roll of a six-sided die can attack. Now, what is not to like about this game? Zones of control reflect the infantry of both sides still fight by the rules of World War I. Infantry units must stop when entering an enemy zone of control. You mount a 1 hex infantry attack against a defender hex, and you attack only the units in the defender hex. Mount a 2 hex or greater infantry attack against a defender hex, and all adjacent enemy hexes must also be attacked. Large-scale infantry attacks take time to set up, and the defender has the time to integrate adjacent units into the defense plan. Moving along, motorized units play by different rules. Though the Germans, with their better trained veteran formations, do it much better than the Allies. Simply stated, any motorized unit with a troop quality higher than any adjacent unit may disregard those adjacent units' zones of control for purposes of movement, combat, and retreat. Only a solid line is proof against motorized unit exploitation and envelopment, and only so long as combat does not create gaps. Additionally, motorized units only may attack a defender hex from 2 hexes without engaging any other adjacent defender units. And the speed of motorized concentration allows the attack to go in before a traditional defensive response can be established. And finally, the Luftwaffe is present in overwhelming strength, allowing the German player to negate the toughest defensive positions if necessary. Each Luftwaffe asset marker provides a 1-column shift on the combat table, and each Allied air asset marker provides the same shift, but there are far fewer Allied markers. Not that the Allies had far fewer planes, they had almost as many apparently, but the Allied air-ground coordination was so cumbersome that planes usually did not arrive in time to influence the battles being fought. So that is Case Yellow, 1940 German Blitzkrieg in the West by Ted Rasier, and has sparked my interest a bit more than it had. Perhaps it will do the same to you. Number 3, this is the game of games, and when it comes to games in general, and when it comes to Blitzkrieg in particular, this is the game you want. Flat out say it. This is the game. Blitzkrieg Legend by Dean Essig, Hans Kischel, John Kistner, MMP, 2012. It was in a 2012 Charles S. Roberts Best World War II Era Board War Game nominee, and I will say that it should have won, even though it was up against some fairly stiff competition with the likes of Red Winter, which won, as well as It Never Snows. This game, hands down, was the better of the 3, but that's just my opinion. And I will leave it at that, because this is the game that I'll be focusing on in depth once this list has ended. So that brings us to number 2, and that is France 40 by Mark Simonich, a designer that is loved by many, and I am one of them. 2013 GMT, and was the 2013 Golden Geek Best War Game nominee. And this game contains 2 separate games, Sickle Cut and Dynamo. Both games use the same rules, share many game pieces, but each has a separate map, its own map, and that's very cool. Sickle Cut, which was Guderian's Drive to the Channel. This game covers the crucial week in May 1940 when the German army broke the French line on the Meuse and raced to the sea at Abbeville. It starts on May 13th, the 3rd day of Case Yellow. 6 panzer divisions passed through the Ardennes and are now at the Meuse River. The French and British raced through the Belgium to reach the Dial line and cover the Gunblow Gap, and the stage is set. Can the Germans cross the Meuse in front of strong opposition? I think they can. And if they can, will they be able to break out from the bridgeheads and advance across the map while threatened by Allied reinforcements pouring in from the north and south I think they can. And then Dynamo retreat to victory. This game covers the British withdrawal to Dunkirk and the evacuation. Starts on May 24th, which was the day the British decide that the British Expeditionary Force is actually in real danger of being cut off from their supply base, and the best option would probably be to head for the coast at Dunkirk. However, many of the German panzer divisions are closer to Dunkirk than the British themselves, so here you have a situation in which the British, you ask, can they reach the coast before the Germans? Can they hold the Dunkirk perimeter for 8 days while they evacuate? Well, that's up to you to decide. The rules for both games highlight armor, air support, and morale. Special rules include Allied heavy tanks, the Gaull Rommel, Hitler's halt order, and French command paralysis. So, all the necessary stuff to simulate case yellow. And then it says, note that the two maps may be linked together for players to study the entire period from May 13th to June 3rd. But there is no combined game scenario. So that is France 40, not to be confused with France 1940. And that brings us to, and I won't necessarily agree with this. In fact, I don't. But according to all you Board Game Geek users out there, you like the lock and load. You just like it. Lock and Load Heroes of the Blitzkrieg by Olivier Revenue and Mark Walker, 2009, Lock and Load Publishing. Um, haven't played it, don't own it, and I must admit I am not that curious about it. So that is number one by technical rank. I will throw my personal number one up there as Blitzkrieg Legend and follow that quickly with either France 40 or Case Yellow 1940 German Blitzkrieg in the West. So there's your list for this week. And as stated, I will be going into the Blitzkrieg Legend a little more in depth, as that is not only a great game, it is one of my all-time favorite games. And I have played this numerous times. As far as success with the Germans, I don't know that it was necessarily a fault within the game design. It's more likely a fault of my own because I have trouble as the attacker. It seems easier to be the defender, but unsuccessful with the Germans pretty much with anything I tried to do, but had a lot of fun doing it nevertheless. So with this game, you have a ton of rivers and canals, but specifically polders, and these are marshy land areas that were prone to flooding. Those are interesting to have to deal with. And of course, you can do the entire campaign, or you can do smaller scenarios. There's a number of scenarios in this thing, and I think I had as much fun doing the Norse scenario as any of the others, dealing with the Dutch. A lot of fun there. But then you have, what else? Some Axis special rules regarding German supply. You have a Kleist group. Parachute and air landing. This was a lot of fun. This took place, I know for sure, in the north, because I dealt with it. And yeah, in games that include Holland, the German player will have one division each of paratroopers and air landing troops. You also deal with a Luft landing division and the 7th Fallschirmjäger division, which the 5 units of this division can arrive by either airdrop or air transport missions. Airdrops of these units can only be done on certain turns, but it's still very cool. And then you have special operations. The German player has 3 special operations markers that can be used on the first turn of the game only. And in this campaign, the Germans did a lot of specialized stuff when it came to combat. I think this reflects that. For flavor, these are named for notable Sturm Abteilung leaders like Dietrich von Koltitz, Walter Koch, and Rudolf Witzig. And the markers are placed during the aircraft refit phase on any bridges or forts in Belgium or Holland, and announce the specific target of the special operation bridge or fort. When it's placed, no actual movement path to the hexes being attacked is required. And then it says a special operation is not resolved until the instant a German combat unit moves adjacent to the marked bridge or fort, at which point a roll is made on the special operations table. and the combat unit can continue its movement after the table has been consulted. So special operation markers are removed from the map if they get a special operations failed result. Otherwise, remove them at the end of the player turn, and that would be thunder and lightning. Each special operations marker can perform one of two types of attacks. Let's hope the power don't go out. Attack a river crossing or attack a fort. Then you have garrison requirements and pauses. So with pauses, the German High Command did not always approve of the wild panzer operations, and this rule is a reflection of their occasional attempts to restrain the headlong drive to the coast, as well as general logistics breakdowns. A pause is a random event whose chance increases at the panzer as the panzers move west. So that's very cool as well. And then you have some Allied special rules with dealing with Allied supply, Allied cooperation. What else? Command indecision. The Allied armies were not prepared for this rapid pace of mechanized operations, and this is reflected by their units having a worse action rating when in move mode. Beyond this, the Allies have some additional restrictions, including initiative problems and strategic mode limits. And they say in a design note that they found in testing that the Allies could use strategic mode to redeploy a little too rapidly, so this is a risky gambit given the vulnerability of units in this mode, so the above limit, while historical, is strictly optional. Then you have stuff that deals with the British Expeditionary Force evacuation and some other things as well. Stubborn defense. After British Expeditionary Force evacuation is declared, the Allies can start building level 1 hedgehogs. What else? Some variants, victory conditions, but all in all, it's got everything that you would expect a simulation of this to have and more. And as I said, I've played this a number of times, and not only is it my favorite Case Yellow game, it is one of my favorite games in general. And I don't know, I think the people that designed this did a great job based on the simulation they were focused on. But the juicy stuff, and I'll read some of this to you, of course, is in the back with the designers and developers notes. And so just sit back while I read this. And it says, this game takes its name from the book, The Blitzkrieg Legend. As I mentioned in a previous show, a lot of these games get their names from books. If you want to know what to read, chances are 9 times out of 10, look at a game title and then look it up and find the book and read it, because they're all almost based on books. But anyway, the 1940 campaign in the West by Karl-Heinz Fraser. The book by Fraser examines the miracle of 1940, in quotes, and how it came about, and to dispel the legend that it was planned as a blitzkrieg, and that's true, it wasn't. The book is not a starting point for getting an overview of the campaign, and is not a narrative of the campaign. It is a very detailed look at parts of the campaign that led to the victory. In this author's analysis, the legend of blitzkrieg was created after the campaign was over. There was no planned blitzkrieg in May of 1940, and the victory was explained and rationalized by claiming that Hitler had invented the blitzkrieg strategy, and this was so revolutionary that it was easier to forgive the Allied commanders that lost the campaign. So Nazi propaganda also helped to create the myth of the new methods created by Hitler that revolutionized warfare. And the Allies were all too willing to accept the propaganda, as it gave their generals an easy excuse. So the German success was not planned in advance in the way it happened, and at times the German High Command was afraid of their own success, as I mentioned. And when the Panzer divisions broke through at Sedan, Hitler said it was an absolute miracle. He was just completely baffled that it even worked. And I think Hitler, his only real intention, at least first and foremost, was to grab enough land to use that specific area in France as a jumping off point for later operations. The fact that what happened did happen just blew his mind. But Hitler and many of the older officers and generals became concerned with the speed of advance of their panzer divisions and felt that it was some Allied trap. This fear of a trap and the unauthorized actions of some of the German commanders, mainly Guderian, led to the Panzer halt order at Dunkirk. And the designer says, I wanted to make a game that showed the campaign and put the players into the position that the contemporary leaders were in. I quickly learned from Dean that writing rules to make the situation work did not, so I tried to use the strengths of the OCS system to take care of the problems for me. Action ratings, movement, in parentheses they have combat and move mode, and headquarters throw ranges were the ways that I tried to show the differences in the command and control of the opposing forces. And then regarding the developer's notes, he says, let me begin by getting something off my chest. I didn't care much for the book that gave title to this game, at least in translation. The Blitzkrieg Legend is quite a slog to read. I greatly preferred the prose used in Lightning War by Ronald Pulaski and The Fall of France by Julian Jackson, a recent pair that don't have all the rich military details of Fraser's book, but still manage to drive home the important points, and some elements of Alistair Horn's To Lose a Battle from 1969 may be a bit dated, but this classic remains a wonderful read. No matter what book you read about the campaign, you'll quickly be struck by some factors that are difficult to recreate, even in a complex rulebook like you'll find in OCS. He says, I'll discuss my take on some of the important ones. And he begins with the Maginot Line, which was probably a good thing overall, securing the Franco-German border. But given the French population woes relative to Germany, all that concrete gave them a fighting chance, and building the defensive barrier didn't come at some comparative cost in tanks or planes. Germany was also putting up some sturdy walls in the 30s, fencing off both France and Poland. And in 1940, France had no shortage of modern weapons relative to her enemy. So what the Maginot Line didn't give was protection all the way to the English Channel. It started sputtering before it got to Sedan, and the industrial region along the Belgian border near Lille wasn't fortified much at all. The defensive weakness near the coast would have been mitigated by fortifying the Dale Line, which was a pre-planned defensive position in central Belgium that the British Expeditionary Force and French would occupy when Germany attacked. But this was not the case. Presumably, Eben Emael, the fort, billed as the strongest fort in the world in 1940, was expected to hold the eastern border longer than a single day. And of interest are a couple of near-miss events. The Germans came close to launching their attack during the preceding winter, which would have been a likely debacle. And the Belgians came close to allowing the British Expeditionary Force as well as the French to, quote, come in during January, thus avoiding something the Allied armies weren't suited for, a meeting engagement along the Dale. And it would be interesting to explore what might have been had the Allies not captured detailed German attack plans carried on a crashed plane, but the degree of hypothetical action is beyond the scope of this design. And the winter German marching orders were going to essentially be a repeat of 1914. They probably would have succeeded to a certain degree, even against a more anchored Allied left flank, but the goals of this plan were very limited, and nothing like the historical decisive victory was contemplated. Because of that crashed plane and subsequent worries that the Allies now had a copy of the attack's blueprint, the winter strategy was replaced with von Manstein's radical idea that shifted the main effort to the Ardennes. This would produce the decisive sickle cut, dividing the Allied coalition in two. Meanwhile, the Allies were also revising their dispositions. For political reasons, it was determined necessary to support Holland with a physical linkage. To achieve this, the French 7th Army was switched from a reserve position to instead occupy the extreme left of the Dale Line, up near Breda in Holland. So rather than being positioned to respond to breakthroughs along the Meuse River, this powerful mobile force would spend the first 4 days of the campaign motoring to Holland and back. The 7th Army withdrew from positions north of Antwerp almost as soon as it reached them. Misuse of the 7th Army and the heavy advance into Belgium was part of a strategic blunder that could have been recreated by a host of special rules. But instead, they kept it simple by just having the Allies start the game in their May 11th position. So the dial plan is followed automatically unless you're playing the alternate campaign. And this leaves the Allies vulnerable to the historical German thrust through the Ardennes. Alas, French military problems didn't end on the morning of the 12th of May when the pre-planned movements were complete. At the top, command was oddly split between Gemlin and Georges, and communication with each other and with distant front lines was problematic. Widespread Allied command indecision is subsumed within details like short throw ranges on the headquarters and limited numbers of reserve and strat mode counters. But no matter which book you read about the campaign, you'll also be struck by the contrast between German and French leadership at lower levels. At Sedan, as at numerous other decisive moments, you find German generals like Guderian leading from the front, personally directing the fighting. Meanwhile, during that same battle, the French 55th Division's General Lafontaine precipitated a panic when he relocated his headquarters away from the action. And the panic at Sedan was also a reflection of French morale that had slipped during the long winter when the soldiers were bombarded with propaganda of the "why fight for Poland" variety. To make matters worse, the troops were largely inactive, and they didn't keep busy conducting large unit maneuvers or even get to fire much live ammo for practice. This is in sharp contrast to the Germans, who used orders and techniques from training exercises to cross the Meuse on the fly. In fact, you don't read much about the French in 1940 doing much of anything on the fly, except maybe fleeing. Even General Flavigny, known as the French Guderian before the war, allowed several delays that made the counterattack at Stonne fizzle before it even got started. This attack would ultimately degenerate into the antithesis of modern blitzkrieg, with tactical control given to an infantry general and tanks deployed as support vehicles, an open hand and not a fist. No summary of Allied problems in this campaign is complete without mentioning something Hans told me when I started developing the game. He says the French moved their medium tanks by rail, and the tanks were designed as support vehicles, so they had small fuel tanks, and thus were incredibly short-ranged when not being moved by rail. Furthermore, the French had nothing like the jerry cans that allowed a panzer to carry its own refill, and this made them dependent on fuel trucks that never seemed to be in the right place at the right time. Again, they resisted, they say, the temptation to write special rules, so those French tanks are slow, but do have a regular move mode side. And although the spotlight in France is rightly shined on Allied failings, it is also important to remember that their first-line divisions fought well. They just weren't prepared to fight the up-tempo actions that were a German specialty, which is why Allied action ratings drop a notch when in move mode. Even so, in 1940, you defend Paris with an Allied army superior in quality to the one defending Moscow a year later in Guderian's Blitzkrieg II. Modeling the Germans was pretty straightforward, since we've essentially seen this army in OCS many times before. As you'll see, the German military is highly efficient, but not quite hitting on all cylinders. There are still quite a few inexperienced units formed after the Polish campaign, so German action ratings are not quite as high overall as in 1941. And even the stars of Blitzkrieg, the Panzer divisions, are shown neither endowed with organic trucks nor blessed by the universal hip shoot. Only the Stukas have this ability. So these minor deficiencies notwithstanding, the tandem of Luftwaffe and Panzers make quite an impression. And soon after the campaign, the Allies would credit their quick defeat to a revolutionary, quote, blitzkrieg form of warfare, and in truth, the shock of the German onslaught did play an important part, but the seeds of defeat were fairly conventional. Even in Holland, where the dramatic air landings put to practice a new wrinkle in warfare, it was 9th Panzer Division's arrival outside Rotterdam on the 13th of May that was decisive, and the Fallschirmjägers were doomed if the Panzers didn't arrive quickly to reinforce them. So, in Belgium and France, the Allies were defeated by old-fashioned case of the slows, in quotes. They couldn't keep pace with the German movement and decision-making. Even given the sluggishness, the Allies still might have done fine had they just kept the 7th Army in reserve. So as the Allied commander in this game, you have some pretty tough battles ahead, but 500-pound gorilla is the Wehrmacht. But it's also a constant struggle just to maneuver your slow-mo forces. It gets frustrating. You see what needs doing, but don't have the rail capacity or movement allowances to redeploy fast enough. And his advice, he says, is to try to hold tough along the Meuse River, giving ground as needed in Belgium. You have enough artillery to pin down the panzers and to hug 'em and slug 'em clinch, but it seems a forlorn hope to run with 'em in the open fields beyond the river. Historically, on May 15th, at the end of just 3 game turns, French Premier Paul Renault called his English counterpart Winston Churchill to inform him that the Allies had been defeated. Holland had begun to lay down its arms the previous evening, and it was now obvious that the panzers had forced crossings of the Meuse River from Sedan to Dinant, ripping a 50-mile hole in the center of the French defensive line. The war continued, of course, but essentially the historical fighting was decided in less than a week. Is the Allied position doomed? And equally important, should it be doomed in an historical model worthy of study? These remain questions of interest 70 years after the fall of France. And he says he'd talked with playtesters who had wanted the game rigged in various ways to ensure a historical German path to victory. And if that's what they want, then they should play France 1940. But anyway, as you'll see, the sort of thing is limited to the turn one setup, with the Allies already committed to the Dale plan and facing a possible double turn. What we've tried to do instead is emphasize the risk-taking behind the sickle cut, and you'll discover that if the Germans do not get back-to-back turns initially, their plan starts to go awry. They still have the best army and air force, of course, one that could probably eventually pound through to Paris, even following the 1914 route through Liège. But that's a route that needs a lot of time and supply points, so commodities that aren't abundant in this game. And during development, a few twists were added with an eye toward increasing the game's replay value. So on the 10th of May, the starting locations of the Belgian Chasseurs d'Ardennes and Dutch Light Division are variables, and the Dynamo scenario begins with rolls to determine the effectiveness of the previous turn's German train-busting missions. And there are lots of ways to vary the campaign setups for those interested in exploring some hopefully better Allied command decisions. So the Blitzkrieg Legend is a large game, so even with its modest 13 turn length, it's not a quick play, but it's definitely an OCS game that can be played to conclusion. And as with all titles in the series, it has drawn me, he says, to repeated play as I tinker with new strategies. To paraphrase Moltke the Elder, perfect strategies remain elusive, and that plans rarely survive first contact with the enemy or an unlucky dice roll. It seems that all good OCS players can do is weigh the considerations, then take risks, and after the current game is done, reset and try to do even better next time. So that is from the game designer and developer's notes, which I always find more than fascinating. And the rulebook, specific rulebook for the game, concludes with the options and house rules. You got 12 official options, and then they list 10 favorite house rules. A number of them dealing with fog of war, anti-tank stuff, as well as step losses. But overall, a fantastic game, and as I've said, a game that I've played numerous times and have enjoyed to the utmost. And as far as anybody new to wargaming, I would definitely not recommend them start with this. And as of this date, anybody that is new to the OCS series, I don't know that I would recommend this game either, especially when you consider that the OCS has out now what I call an OCS starter kit, so you should start with that. If you're a seasoned veteran, then by all means pick this up. Even if you're not specifically a fan of the era or the particular campaign it attempts to simulate, it's a fantastic game. It's full of flavors, a ton of different things to consider. And obviously, if you're a fan of Case Yellow, this is the game you want. It is the game of games, a fantastic simulation. So that is the Blitzkrieg Legend, and that is Case Yellow. As such, that is the end of the show. And as far as future shows go, it has come to my realization not too recently that I have yet to do a show on Kursk as well as Stalingrad, and well, you kind of got to cover that stuff. They are staples in anybody's East Front kitchen cabinet. So maybe I'll focus on something along those lines. But again, my tastes change fairly rapidly. So I say that, and then I could come back with a show about the American Revolution, which it's just a joke. That will never happen. My interest in that is none. But that's about it for this episode. So thanks for listening, and keep gaming.
Don't let it steal your